Thank you for your presence. Amen. Scripture reading is Mark 8, 13 through 21. Then he left them, go back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, "It is because we have no bread." Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Or are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" 12, they replied. "And when I broke the seven loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" They answered, 7. He said to them, "Do you still not understand?"
It's all about the bread, isn't it? They say in California you can rob a bank with one of these. Everybody's on a keto diet, you know? Bread. I get pretty distracted by food. And if I know there's not enough food downstairs for potluck, that's distressing. And I love this story in Mark that James just read. Because what were the disciples distracted by? Food. They're like, "We only have 1 loaf of bread. What are we going to do?" And Jesus is like, "I'm trying to teach you something here." And he's trying to teach them that you got to watch out for the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Oh, my sermon up here, sorry. It was here. All right. So we're reading today, our scripture reading is kind of the context of where our sermon is today, and it's a little bit about the disciples' confusion. And when I read that, I'm a little confused too, and I'm like, well, what is Jesus saying? And he's trying to teach them something more, and they're thinking about the bread. You know, they're like, you know, we got 5 men in the boat, we got 1 loaf of bread, you know, priorities here, we got to eat. But Christ is talking about spiritual confusion and not seeing the bigger picture. And I think that happens to us a lot. We're not seeing things God's way, and we fail to learn what God is wanting us to learn. In the New Testament, leaven signifies wickedness and malice in contrast to sincerity and truth. So we lack truth, we lack understanding, and we become dense for a variety of reasons. Perhaps we don't get the picture or the message because of the people we're hanging out with. Sometimes we have friends that distract us from maybe what's important. Perhaps it's our media and the choices and the things that we're watching on YouTube that vie for our attention. And so we miss maybe some deeper meaning in things that God's trying to teach us. Perhaps it's because we aren't reading God's word. He can't speak through that if we're not reading it. And sometimes it's just our lack of faith. We read it, but we can't apply it. The disciples were not seeing the truth because they were hungry, and they were focused on the wrong thing. So the story picks up with the main thrust of the sermon today. The next story we read is the blind man is healed at Bethsaida. And it's interesting, Mark introduced spiritual blindness and then transitions to a story about a man that had real blindness and how Jesus approached him. Do you think that's a coincidence? I don't think so. And so that's why I think there's more to learn. And I was reading a book a couple weeks ago, and I read this story with a new eye, lack of pun intended. And so I've been thinking a lot about this story. So let's read, pick up in verse 22 in Mark 8. He says, "Then he came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to him, and he begged him to touch him. So he took the blind man by hand and then led him out of town. And when he had spit on his eyes and put hands on him, he asked him if he saw anything. And he looked up and he said, 'I see men like trees walking.' Then he put his hands on his eyes again and made him look up. And he was restored and saw everyone clearly. Then he sent him away to his house, saying, 'Either go into the town, nor tell anyone in the town.'" So what do we have, like 4 verses here, and I think there's a lot of really interesting truths that we can glean here. We see that friends, or maybe not friends, brought this blind man to Jesus. Now Bethsaida was not known for their believers. During the time of Jesus, Bethsaida was a village on the Sea of Galilee on the far northeast side. It was a fishing village where the fishermen hunted along the dark weed-infested caverns below the shores. Sounds like kind of a cool place to explore. Bethsaida was also the home of Peter and Andrew and Philip, who were Christ's disciples. And later Jesus rebuked the people of this town for not receiving him and believing his words. We can assume then maybe that this blind man was not a believer, and maybe his friends were not believers, because they thrust this man at Jesus and begged him to do a miracle that day. Sadly, maybe they didn't even know the blind man. Maybe they just picked him up on the outskirts of town and they wanted to test Jesus and to see what he could do, because everyone's talking about what Jesus can do. They're like, I want to see that for myself. I want to be entertained by that. So hey, there's a blind man. Jesus, what can you do? So it's kind of chaotic, I imagine, when Jesus enters the city. And Jesus does something interesting. He takes his hand and he leads him out of the city. The second part of the verse is small, but an important part of the event. Jesus then spits in the man's eyes. Now, he could have healed him without spitting in his eyes, because we've read that Jesus did that before. And we see that there's no impulsivity here. However, it was a very calculated process. As Jesus takes him out of the village, he spits on his eyes, and then he touches him. So we're left to ask, what's the reason for the spit? Most commentators agree that the warmth of Jesus' saliva would have soothed the man's pain. As we see in the following verses, the blind man knew the difference between people and trees, so we can assume that he had seen trees before, and that he was able to make that distinction, so he's probably not born blind. There must have been something that caused him to blind, maybe leaving open wounds on his eyes. Saliva may have been simply another act of compassion for Christ. This action for the blind man may have helped him to begin to have just a little faith that Jesus could actually heal him, because he felt the care of this miracle worker. Jesus, the supernatural healer, in his compassion for the man with little faith, gave him something to put him at ease by showing him a little bit of the modern medicine at the time to provide comfort, and Jesus played along with the idea that saliva could heal. Well, we may not be able to prove that the man had a pre-existing painful condition from the text. We can make sense that Jesus' compassion would have propelled him to care for the man's pain prior to healing. Now, it's interesting, we've known for years that saliva does more than physical cleansing. When you suck on a cut finger, white blood cells in your spit release an arsenal of weapons to defeat bacterial invaders. First, white blood cells can simply engulf the bacteria and die as martyrs, or they can shoot bacteria with deadly substances that cause the bacteria to disintegrate. But white blood cells can also do something even cooler. They create sticky, viscous nets and throw them out like lassos to capture and wrestle bacteria to their deaths. So they're like little Spider-Mans. We have a whole separate immune system in our saliva. And maybe Jesus knew more than we thought he did. Researchers find that human saliva also contains antibacterial agents such as secretory IgA, lactoferrin, lysosine, and peroxidase. In the same way we understand that God not only is one who sympathizes with us, but moves in action to care for our hurts in an effort to grow our faith. He's often faithful to soothe the throbbing aches of our soul as he moves to a place of restoration and completion. But Christ then asks, do you see anything? And what does the blind man say? I see people. They look like trees walking around. That is, he could distinguish them by their motion. I don't know about you, can you identify with the blind man? As humans, it's so easy for us just to see a muffled picture of those around us. We don't really know what's going on in their lives at home. We don't know their thoughts, their intentions. And our subjective psyche can help play tricks on us, and our biases sometimes lead us astray. So those of you that were born in alive in 1977, raise your hand. Okay. Can you name the biggest aeronautical disaster in the 70s?
Apollo.
Merlin said what?
Apollo 11.
Apollo 11 in the 70s? That could be.
No, that was 60. Yeah.
This disaster, over 500 people died in pretty much an instant. You guys, do you remember the Tenerife crash of 1977? Well, I'm going to introduce you to it, if you haven't heard it. So the passengers aboard KLM flight 4805 didn't know it, but they were in the hands of the most experienced, accomplished pilots in the world. Captain Jacob Van Zanten didn't just have the knack for flying, he had attention to detail, a methodical approach, and a spotless record, which made him a natural choice to lead KLM's safety program. It was no surprise then when the airline was keen to show him off. One magazine ad featured the smiling captain captured it all. KLM, from the people who made punctuality possible. Even seasoned pilots, not exactly the type of individuals prone to swoon, regarded him as a celebrity. Now we're on the flight deck of the 747 en route from Amsterdam to the Las Palmas airport in the Canary Islands. Van Zanten must have felt a sense of pride. Today's trip was moving along with smooth precision that had come his hallmark. The straightforward schedule: land in Las Palmas, refuel, and transport a new set of passengers back home to Poland. But something happens. There's a bomb that goes off in the Las Palmas airport, and so it caused a diversion. So they know the next thing they have to do is find an airport to land in. So he lands in Tenerife Island about 1:10 p.m. Now, you don't need to be a seasoned airline pilot to appreciate that Tenerife was no JFK. It was a tiny airport, and it was a single runway not meant to support jumbo jets. And imagine there's a lot of planes being diverted to this tiny airport. With his plane safely parked at the edge of the runway, the captain checked his watch, seeing the time he was struck with a worrisome thought: the mandated rest period. So if he didn't leave by 6:30, so he had 5 hours, if he didn't leave, he would be required to sleep there overnight. Now, there was no place for these 500 plus passengers to go. And so he was starting to worry, and what am I going to do with these people? And you couldn't leave after 6:30. It wasn't just a fine. It wasn't just against policy. It was a crime punishable by prison time. And so that mandated rest, he had to beat that. But taking that would open a can of worms. Here in Tenerife, there would be no replacement crew to take over and no place for the people to sleep. And there was stress that was starting to increase in Van Zanten, and he wanted to save time. And it was like being stuck at a red light when you're late for a big meeting. You feel that stress building. But the air traffic control personnel who worked at Tenerife were on a different mindset. There was a soccer game on, and they were more focused on that. Let's see, 20 minutes. So after 20 minutes of landing, the tower told Van Zanten that he should let his passengers off, and he wouldn't let them because he was aiming to leave on time. And so he started to talk to his crew, what can we do? They're like, well, let's, so we can get to Holland on time, let's skip refueling in Las Palmas and do it here. So they started to refuel, which is a 35-minute process. And while they were doing that, they learned that they had reopened the airport in Las Palmas. So the captain's even more frustrated because now he's going to be late at his own decision making. And so they're waiting, kicking himself over his decision to refuel. Something bad happens. What starts to roll in? But fog. And it grows thicker, and the visibility is only 300 meters. So poor that gazing out of the cockpit window, the captain couldn't even see the end of the runway. Van Zanten knew that the very moment the fog got worse, that the Tenerife Tower soon shut down the airport. He saw that his window of opportunity was even getting smaller. It was now or never. But what the captain did next was completely out of character. Van Zanten revved up the engines and the plane lurched down the runway. "Wait a minute," said his co-pilot. "What are you doing? We don't have ATC clearance." "I know that," he replied. And the captain hit the brakes. "Go ahead and ask." The co-pilot got on the radio and received airway clearance, approval of the flight plan, but did not get the vital takeoff clearance. Yet determined to take off, Van Zanten turned the throttles to full power and roared down the foggy runway. The jumbo jet was gaining momentum when seemingly out of nowhere, the scariest sight Van Zanten could have imagined appeared before him. Pan Am 747 was parked across the runway, and Van Zanten was approaching it at takeoff speed. There was no way to stop, no way to swerve. Instinctively, Van Zanten knew that his only chance was to take off early. "Come on, please," the captain urged the plane. He pulled the aircraft's nose up desperately, dragging its tail on the ground and throwing up blinding sparks everywhere. The nose of Van Zanten's plane managed to nearly clear the parked 747. But just when it looked like he was in the clear, the underside of the KLM ripped through the top of the Pan Am plane. And the KLM plane burst into a fire explosion as it hurtled 500 yards down the runway. Van Zanten, his entire crew, and all of his passengers were killed. In all, 584 people lost their lives that day. The community was stunned. How does the man who's in charge of safety, who's the model of safety, make these comedy of errors of decisions? How does this happen? Van Zanten's desire to avoid a delay started out small enough. At first, he simply wanted to keep the passengers on board to save time. But as the delay grew longer, the potential loss seemed larger. By the time an overnight delay seemed almost inevitable, he was so focused on avoiding it that he turned out all other considerations in that matter, his common sense and years of training, and made the decision to head down the runway. He believed himself to be the expert. He dismissed his co-pilot. He was focused on the loss that could happen. A late arrival. He was so focused on his agenda that he failed to see the reality of the situation, that they were in danger. In a spiritual sense, we too are in danger. We're distracted and sometimes have a false sense of urgency that shapes how we react to situations. We're afraid of loss, and we want to control the situations, and our biases control our judgment. We see people like trees. Sometimes we miss the danger, we miss the opportunity, and we miss the good. As Christians, we realize that we are imperfect and that our hearts are exceedingly deceitful, so we do approach the healer. But it might be that after Jesus gives us spiritual sight, we're not totally restored yet. We see people as trees, as objects. We're blind to them as real people with real needs. We are blind to the situation and the reality as Jesus sees it. So why doesn't he open our eyes right away? And why didn't he heal the blind man right away? You know, recently I was talking to Kylie's principal, and we were talking about leadership and the challenges, and he said something to me that was really hard-hitting. As leaders, and I would add as Christians, we should not be surprised by other people's brokenness. And that pierced my heart, because I usually am surprised when people screw up. And I don't know why, because we're all broken. I screw up all the time, but I act surprised. And recently, I learned that my own biases sometimes affect my behavior. And I had an instance in my job about a week ago that I was so thankful that my desire to be kind overrode what I was really thinking. And so every 2 days I go through and I look at the accounts and I find out who hasn't made their payments. And having it be my own business, I get pretty possessive about that, and I get kind of riled up when people aren't paying their bills. And I had this one particular where I had made contact with a patient, and she was supposed to give me her insurance information. And I was just, in my mind, I'm like, why don't people take their bills seriously? I've sent 3 statements, I've sent 2 letters, I've had 1 phone call, and all she needs to do is give me her insurance information, and I could bill this claim. But right now, I have to bill it to her, it's for the full amount, she's gonna end up going to collections, and I'm just getting irritated. And I'm just like, people are bums. And so I was kind of dogging on, the situation, and I'm like, I will call her one more time. So I called her and I left a message, and I was like, I really like to help you solve this problem. Please call me. So I'm in my car and I see that she's called the office and it's bumped into my cell phone, and I'm like, I gotta take this. So I pull over and she gives me the information I need, and then she says to me, thank you so much for your patience. It's been really hard since we lost the baby. And I thought, I was like, oh my goodness. You don't know what people are going through. And I could have called her and said, I'm going to send you to collections. You need to, I need you to call. And just added to her hurt. And I was just so glad that I had been kind, but I realized God sees the heart and that I had screwed up. So our biases sometimes shape our behavior, and we don't always know the full story. So we back up to the story, and Jesus had asked the blind man, what do you see? Was the blind man healed yet? Sorta. One touch, everyone else gets healed right away. I wonder what he was thinking. He's like, this is it? I don't know, maybe he was happy with it. But he asked them, what do you see? Now keep in mind that Jesus never asked questions for information. He's God in the flesh. He knows that all thoughts and things of man. So Jesus already knew what the man could see before he even asked the question. So Jesus is seeking to impart revelation to the blind man, not to get information from him. Other examples in Scripture where God uses questions can include Cain, where are you, my brother? Moses, what is in your hand? God asked Elijah, what are you doing here up on Mount Horeb? Jesus also asked several significant questions. Who do the people say that I am? Who is your neighbor? What should we feed the multitudes? Bartimaeus, what do you want the Son of Man to do for you? Jesus knew what the man could see. He asked the question, desiring for the man to seek one more touch. Now, most people are content with just a little blessing. Most people would have answered the question, what do you see like this? Well, things are a little blurry, but I'll be all right. When I get a little more time, I'll come back and you can finish the job. But I have some other things to do first. The blind man at that point could have walked away. He's only legally blind. He has enough function now to get a job. Do what he needs to do. But that would seem a little crazy, wouldn't it? Because we know the power of the healer. We'd say, but Jesus isn't done yet. You're leaving just before the good part. So here's the key to fuzzy vision. We have to stay in the presence of the healer. Many of us, though, walk away while God is still doing his work. We get impatient, we get discouraged, and frankly, we're afraid of the real work that God will do in us, and that freaks us out. We expect what we expect God will do, he sometimes doesn't do it the way we want us to do. And we don't like that. So we prefer to walk away with a partial blessing. The promise is this, that we can be sure that what he does will be precisely what we need. I have a quote on my phone that I refer to. I have a whole list of quotes that I refer to a lot, but this particular one speaks to my fears, and it challenged me. And it reads, "You will never find a courageous cynic." You will never find a courageous cynic. And that says to me, if you're happy with the status quo and if you go through life as an Eeyore, seeing the worst in a situation, you're never going to have courage. And courage is what it takes to stay in the presence of Christ. Because things aren't going to go our way. We don't get what we want sometimes. It takes courage to stick around and see what God can do in our life. It's courage to be uncomfortable in the interim. The good news is as we stick close, Christ moves in for the second touch. That is when we walked out our faith, all while Jesus has ministered us with compassion, God completes his work. So I ask again, why doesn't he open our eyes right away? Wouldn't that help us all be better Christians and we get along good with each other? Why didn't he heal a blind man right away? He could have. Jesus took the blind man through a process of faith in order to restore his sight. Jesus helped the blind man step across the line from unbelief to belief. He can take us from a dense to enlightened, from a fool to wise, from biased to fair, from hurt to healed, from confusion to clarity, and he takes us from lost to redeemed. Jesus is in the business of restoration. It's interesting, we go back in the story, Jesus took him out of the city. Now there's probably some consternation as to why he was asked to follow. The blind man probably didn't think that was very easy. I don't know you. I'm a blind man. I rely on my senses, and there's a lot of chaos here, and you want me to follow you? But Jesus grabbed him by the hand. It wasn't very convenient. It required a little bit of faith. But as Jesus led with each step, the blind man realized he was in the hands, literally, of a capable God. Christ is helping us walk out our faith, and at times before we can see him work, we have to follow him. Even when it seems counterintuitive, and everybody's bumping us around, and we don't get it, and we feel ill-equipped. But Jesus wants to lead us out into solitude. For the man who took him out of the city, he wants to lead us out of our busyness and a distraction for spiritual renewal, which seems counterintuitive. There Christ can complete his work and give us the second touch. The lesson in faith continues. After Christ healed the blind man, he then asked him not to tell anyone. Why? But Lord, I want to tell people. Look what you've done for me. But again, Christ is wanting him to walk out his faith. You know, Christ is going to ask him to do things that don't make sense. He's going to ask you to step down from the fight. He's going to ask you to make the first move. He's going to ask you not to take the credit. He's going to ask you to take the heat. He's going to ask you to shut up. He's going to ask you to keep your cool when things just fell apart. And you ask, why? Why would I do this? Because with healing and renewal, that second touch comes gratitude. As we walk out our faith, it leads to obedience. It's a natural thing because we see what God has done in our lives and how he's healed us and changed us. I don't know about you, but some days things are as clear as mud. And I liken it to the summer when the cotton's flying everywhere. I feel like I have this thin cotton veil over my eyes and I constantly can't see nothing. I can't read, and I'm blaming it on being 40, but I think it's the cotton. And like a nail, I sometimes need more than one hit. I need Jesus, and most of the time, I need a second touch. You know, in the Bible, we have examples where repeated efforts were necessary to accomplish a desired result. Joshua marched around Jericho how many times? Elijah prayed 7 times before the rain came down. Jesus prayed how many times to let this cup pass from me? The King of Glory faced some enemies that refused to go away after the first punch. Like driving a nail into a piece of wood, you will face some challenges that require more than one strike of the hammer. Also, we're reminded by this account in Mark 8 that Jesus knows our hurts and meets us where we're at in order to take us to a place of complete healing and redemption and spiritual enlightenment. He will not stretch our faith more than we can handle, but will tend to our wounds as he reveals more of himself. Through the instance of the blind man being healed at Bethsaida, we are given a sweet account of how Jesus opens the eyes of our hearts so that we can see him more clearly and we can see others more clearly. Do you have walking tree people in your life? Can you trust what you are seeing today? Are you sure that your reality is as clear as you think it is? Are you making decisions out of the wrong reasons like Van Zanten? Are you so busy that Christ, who is trying to walk something out with you, you're leaving before the second touch? Do you prefer just to get doctored up and then you'll come back later if you need it? I think about taking antibiotics. A lot of people will take about 3 days until the sore throat goes away, and then they wonder why they get sick again. But yeah, are we any different? We need to stay in Christ's presence. We can be encouraged from the story today that healing in truth can be a gradual process, but if we give Jesus time in our life, he will give us that.